Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. Hello and welcome again to the Elixir Poetry Podcast. This week we're talking to Chris Kelham, who I believe is a senior lecturer at the Guildhall, and he specialises in drama. Hello, Chris.
Good morning, Helen. Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's really lovely to have you on our programme. So do you have a poem that really speaks to you? Which poem will you talk to us about?
I have a poem, and it's by the Vietnamese poet Ocean Vuong. And I've been following his work, reading his work for a number of years. And there's many poems I could have selected for this, but I thought I would choose this one, which for reasons we'll talk about, I'm sure.
What's it called?
It's called Ars Poetica as the Maker.
Okay. Could you first of all read it to us?
Yes, of course. Ars Poetica as the Maker, and God saw the light and it was good. Genesis 1:4. Because the butterfly's yellow wing, flickering in black mud, was a word, stranded by its language. Because no one else was coming, and I ran out of reasons. So I gathered fistfuls of ash, dark as ink, hammered them into marrow, into a skull thick enough to keep the gentle curse of dreams. Yes, I aimed for mercy, but came only close as building a cage around the heart, shutters over the eyes. Yes, I gave it hands, despite knowing that to stretch that clay slab into 5 blades of light, I would go too far. Because I, too, needed a place to hold me. So I dipped my fingers back into the fire, pried open the lower face until the wound widened into a throat, until every leaf shook silver with that god-awful scream. And I was done. And it was human.
Wow. Wow. Chris, do you know that phrase in Spanish, respiramos por la herida, which means breathe through the wound?
Wonderful.
It's wow. Wonderful. Okay. So this poem is apparently really difficult it strikes me, it seems to be very mysterious. And also, well, there's 2 things I'd like to ask you about, actually. First, about its mysterious nature and what we think it's about, but also about you as a theatrician. This poem is laid out on the page in a striking way, and we've never talked about this on Elixir, about the way that a poem is displayed on a page. But I think it's going to be interesting to hear you talk about this as someone who takes things off the page and into the oral space as a drama teacher, how students cope with the way that something is displayed on the page. Sorry, I'm getting a bit too far. First of all, let me roll right back, Chris, and ask you, why do you like this poem?
Well, another title for the poem is Craft. And I think the title is taken from a Horace poem written in ancient Roman times. And it was Horace's advice to writers and playwrights and poets. And I think Ocean Vuong is taking that as a springboard into what it is to write poetry, to grapple and struggle and grasp language. And I very easily see the metaphors with my own practice, my own art, and the pain, not wishing to sound sentimental or idealistic about this, but the struggle, the battle, the torment, the terror that is involved in making art and should be involved in making art. Also the joy, also the absolute pleasure,
Mm.
the rich, rich joy that comes from it as well. This is all evident in this poem, and I feel the resonances loudly
Mm.
when I read it, and the bravery as well.
Yeah, and the task you're facing with, as he makes really clear in this poem, actually, this challenge to God, that actually we're trying to do something that is way beyond our human realm, if you like.
Yes,
you know.
yes, yes.
And the other time that I've come across that is in a poem by William Carlos Williams. I think it's called The Yellow Flower, where he makes reference to Michelangelo bringing the figures of the slaves out of the stone, and and compares this with the effortless, delicate beauty of a yellow flower. That we can't see any of that, of God's struggle, if you like, in creation, but we have this, this knowledge of our partiality, of our smallness in the face of creation, and yet we set ourselves the task of creating. So yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah, there's something when we talk to actors about character. What do we mean by character? We talk about a character being revealed rather than something that's made
Yeah.
uh, or added to. And the Michelangelo sculpture analogy is there that the sculptor the character's revealed. You begin
In there, yeah.
oh, and it's inside. Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to. I mean, I'd like to go back to what you're saying about pain. Do you think that that's something that comes with age? I mean, when I'm working with young people, they're very much on the side of the joy and the playfulness of language. And sometimes they create things that's so strikingly beautiful and strikingly painful, but they seem to do it, they seem to approach their task with a with a natural confidence in their ability to express themselves. That often, I think, grown-ups lose, that we lose that confidence. And therefore the creative process becomes more painful. I guess we're more conscious of how hard it is, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So do you find your students will leap into their creativity, or do you find them sitting on the edge, if you like, and having to?
Yeah, it's a good question. They do. I mean, a lot of it's how you set up the environment for them to
Mhm.
leap in, because of course there's vulnerability here, and if you're asking students to reveal an aspect of themselves that's deep
Mm.
and has meaning, then you need to create an environment where they feel safe and willing to do that.
Yeah.
I do find that there's a leap of joy to come into the room. They're obviously full of enthusiasm at this early stage. The flower analogy, they're not yet fully blossomed, so there's a lot of energy, sometimes misplaced energy, but nevertheless useful. And of course, you act as a guide, I suppose, to lead them down pathways which perhaps are less comfortable, less familiar, and how they react, how they respond to those provocations, it reveals
Mhm.
something of the human,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is the beginning of acting.
This poem does seem really raw. I mean, it's incredibly sophisticated, I think, the way that he uses this image. Um,
Mm,
but it's also very raw, as you say, and it is about the pain of creating, and
mm.
the glory, if you like, of
Yes, absolutely.
creating.
Yeah.
Um, and and as I said, it's presented in a fragment style, even though there is a narrative running right the way through. If you were asking a student to perform a piece like this, what would the way that something's presented on the page influence you at all, or do you simply take the words boldly as they stand in the air, if you like?
Yes, that you absolutely would. I mean, it would be foolhardy to ignore the extraordinary structure and form of this poem.
Yeah.
Shakespeare has it as well. Shakespeare lays out his text in a way for actors to be able to read it very quickly and understand very quickly what he's trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And Ocean Vuong, it clearly here is breaking up, as you say, fragmenting the text, the first thing I think of is breath. Where's the breath here? How the breath is very difficult to stay consistent with the breath. And, the technical side of you is saying breathe at the full stops, move on the suspension of breath, etc. But here he constantly trips you up. He constantly pulls the rug from underneath you, and you find yourself without breath. And that's interesting. That's interesting what that reveals.
And is that about the struggle to create is that an expression of that struggle, do you think?
That's absolutely right. I think it's a struggle to breathe. It's a struggle to it's life or death.
Yeah.
And this revealing as well, just to go back to your previous question. I think when he talks about building a cage around the heart and shutters over the eyes, that for me is a clear invocation of that, or evocation of that idea that what is it to reveal as artists? What do we, when we really reveal something of ourselves, that's painful. It's hard to go to that space within and to take the time and the energy and draw on the resource that allows you to communicate that aspect of ourselves. And what does that mean to do that? And how will that be received? It's terrifying. It's absolutely.
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely terrifying. And I like this prison image is to me really interesting, just because I'm really, I obsess about the relationship between being trapped and exile. Which do you prefer? Being imprisoned in a place that you find alien, or being exiled out of everything you know? And that these are slightly different. And often you find that creatives feel themselves in some way exiled. And, it's become quite theory of the obvious in modern times, because people are so voluble about their sense of identity that either imprisons them or allows them to escape. And they often create a narrative around their poetic persona according to their life experience. But and so often they portray themselves as escaping from a cage of definition that has been imposed upon them in a previous time. But at the same time, I think that writers have found very appealing and found very authentic to themselves this idea that somehow they are rejected prophets, if you like, that they live in a type of exile from their own worlds and their own communities. If you take someone like Ocean Vuong, right, he's very, very conscious of his personal identity and his personal narrative, and he has even written a book about his early life and his biography as a very young person. And it seems to me that for him, one of the drivers of his creativity is this unease, if you like, between, yes, I'm Vietnamese and I'm the son of my mother and I'm an American and so on, but also I'm a writer. I'm doing this thing that I don't associate with being Vietnamese, and I'm writing in English and I'm not writing in Vietnamese, and I'm doing all of these things that either free me or imprison me, and I'm not really not really sure what it is, but it's that tension that gives me the creative drive. I feel that's sorry, I'm just extrapolating for no real purpose here, but it feels to me as if that is something that we all struggle with. The who am I? And if I say that I'm peeling away layers of myself in this sort of platonic, I must have a hidden essence somewhere way, that attraction of the need to be authentic and wanting to be authentic and the pain of getting there is often what, drives the creativity in the first place.
Yeah.
And of course, in our modern age, when we're being told that we're just simulations and that AI is just as good as us, I think we're going to be finding more of this tension,
Yeah, and we need to somewhere in all of this acknowledge the deeply human element of it, which you can't. No computer can capture those tiny nuances and subtleties of human feeling.
Well, this is where where someone like Ocean Vuong will be very powerful because of his appreciation of the sheer gorgeousness of words. The treasure house that is language, and the way that he chooses these incredibly rich and beautiful words, And I think we're going to go, I'm hoping we're going to go more towards this type of almost Baroque discourse because, where we really, really enjoy our words for their succulence, for their physical beauty, if you like, because we've had periods in poetry where poetry is very spare and very limpid and beautiful because of that. But I think actually our only defense against computers is the ability to choose and use the full range of our language, you know?
Mm, mm. And where that language springs from
Yeah,
is extraordinary, isn't it? That is a well of cultural and historical life lived that
yeah,
gives birth to a word that seems
yeah,
so extraordinary. It is in antithesis to what you're writing, or acts in juxtaposition with something else that you're writing. That's that extraordinary moment, that concatenation of words that you think, how have these come together? What it's like a beautiful film.
yeah,
The montage of images, like how do these images go together? They shouldn't go together, but they putting them together, they release something extraordinary,
yeah,
which is unexpected.
yeah.
That's
And
very
of course, this
exciting.
is something that AI is well, it might learn to do, but is also at the moment is denied that ability to be fed by serendipity, you know?
Yes, it's not
Yeah,
connect. It's not plugged into something
yeah,
which is deeply human, and is about living life and experience and feeling pain, feeling joy, feeling suffering, all of these things that
yeah.
make us human.
Yeah, I think that it's important to maintain a little bit of chaos rather than order. You know, I'm at the moment struck by this idea. I mean, and he's clearly interested in allowing chaos in some form, linguistically and emotionally. You know, I'm really struck by the way that people at the moment are talking about the way that they're going to organize assisted dying, and I'm really, really struck by the fact that the bureaucratization of decisions about people's lives allows people to dehumanize the people they're talking about. You know, so it's almost as if the more order there is, the less humanity there is. And I'm not
Mm,
obviously making an argument against order of any form,
mm,
but sometimes the best solutions, the best poems, the best experiences come out of those moments that are not designated for us and that are just there. You know, they're not part of our organized day. And
mm.
I wonder whether you could talk to our listeners a little bit about how you approach the craft of, the craft of drama for students, how you free them into a space where they can actually really explore what they're trying to do, because you were talking about setting up the environment and so on. But is there anything that you've learned over your years of teaching that has spoken to you about, what's the most important in that? Because this is what Ocean Vuong's doing. He's making this plea, isn't he, for sticking at things until you get them
Yeah.
right. But when you're dealing with awakening that in another, is there anything that you've learned in your work as a drama teacher that really influences you about the way you approach it with them?
Yeah, gosh.
I mean, I
I
think you
mean,
once told me that you taught some Chinese students who behaved very differently according to the environment they were in, or the makeup of the group that they were in.
yeah, I think a big part of my interest in theatre and my interest in teaching is the community, is the togetherness, the shared thinking, the shared, and I don't mean that it's flattened out. I mean that with shared thinking is very dynamic.
Yeah.
Creating, building that community, that sense of togetherness yields so much exciting work and so
Yeah.
much unexpected reveals for actors, and that for me is at the heart of my practice, my work. um and yes, working with Chinese students was a very different experience because they had that already. They understood that on a very deep level, in a way that working with Western students, as I do at the moment, they don't understand that. It's much more individualized. It's much more, this is about me. This is about my future, my career, and it's understandable. It's not to blame them. It's the structures they're working within. But there was something in working with the Chinese students that they had this inbuilt care and sense of responsibility towards each other,
Mhm.
despite the dynamics between them.
Yeah.
And that was extraordinary because you could. you could go quite far with them emotionally. They would they had an emotional depth and breadth that was well beyond their years.
That's really interesting. That's
Needed to be channeled. It needed
yeah,
to be carefully crafted because, of course, it was, as you say, chaotic, and that's exciting. But you can't ask an audience to witness that chaos if it's not deliberate.
yeah. No, of course, China's a very, very ordered society, and
Yeah.
I lived there for a period, and I came to the conclusion in the end that everything was so ordered that the only thing that was free were the seven deadly sins that went completely uncalibrated. That your emotional and moral world was something that you were was left entirely up to you.
Well, that's
It does
interesting
create
because
this incredible depth of feeling and articulacy, actually. Yeah.
yeah, yes, and that's interesting because Shakespeare explores that a bit in Measure for Measure, his
All right.
play with the Duke and Angelo, and he asks, he's curious to see how Angelo, this minister, will manage the city without him. So he disguises himself and watches Angelo, and of course it becomes a dictatorship. It becomes um, uh, awful. And there is this underbelly of society, Mistress Overdone, and this underbelly as this brothel underneath, where of course it's the release. The wound is opened, and
Mm,
society, the real society, lives there and breathes there, and the
mm,
energy and the fire comes from there. And Angela, all of this order at the top is of course masking
mm.
terrible things.
But also obviously people go a bit wild when you take your foot off their head, but also that, you're never
Mm,
quite sure whether the passion is caused by the experience of the imprisonment. So we're talking about imprisonment, or whether it's would have been there anyway,
mm,
but it
mm.
becomes when it gets released. I mean, I guess one of the things that Ocean Vuong is interested in is this idea of human agency, and why it is that some people can do things and people can't, and that relationship between hunger and fear and need and ease and comfort, how that affects the way that we look upon creativity.
Yes, yes.
So
And that speaks to his, of course, immigrant experience, which
yeah,
is core to his poetry,
yeah,
core his perspective on the world, as you said earlier, the outsider looking in.
yeah,
And I also feel in his work this fragmentation, just to come back to that, because I think it's really pertinent. And I find it fascinating, the fragmentation, because it's closer to human logic
yeah.
uh, than linear structure of a story. I find his poetry far more enervating because of the fragmentation, because of the displacement than I would if it was a story.
I absolutely agree with that, with what you're saying here, but I also think that there's a refusal. I mean, he's a very intellectual person, but it's a refusal of intellect because he understands that with his words he is trying to speak directly to the heart, so which is why he will come in at a tangent, if you like, or many different tangents to speak
Mm,
to speak of those logical structures that order our world, but that also interrupt our ability to access and process our emotions and process the way that we are feeling. So
mm,
I like that. I mean, that's what I mean about the mystery. He makes quite a difficult poem, actually, an image that's quite hard to follow and that forces us to use our senses to understand, use our eyes and our ears and our hands to see what's going on with him. And I think that's because the great reveal is the nature of his heart, not the nature of his mind, and that I think is really, really powerful. If you have a persona which is always defining itself through difference to other people, what actually he reveals in the end is the commonality of his experience with everyone. It's like everyone is an exile in their own skin, if you like. Everyone feels that sense of separation. Everyone strives for contact, for connection, for the beauty of creation. You don't actually have to be a poet or a dramatist or whatever, but we're all trying to create those intangible moments, if you like, of beauty that are something that we've created, and that wonderful I was done and it was human. We were seeking after that. And that
yeah.
that is so beautiful in this poem.
Yes.
And it's and that again, so that mixture of demagoguery and humility. It's beautiful the way that he brings up those contradictions in our humanity. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Mm. A poem should not mean but be. That was a quote I read. I think it was
Oh,
Archie Cliche. A poem should not mean but be. And I think the same is with an actor. That the actor should not mean, should not present meaning, but be living, a living person that reveals the complexity of our experience. And that's how we really leave a theatre, I
yeah,
think, considering what we've seen. But too often we see presentations
yeah.
of people that for me are two-dimensional.
Yeah, and but also that's how you inspire the emotion in your viewer, is if you're actually being, and if
Mhm.
in the most simple, innocent way, people leave the theatre actually believing that person did die, or
Yes.
that person
Yeah.
did lose their love, and that you're totally invested in their reality. That's when you know you've been successful. In,
Yes, yes, yes.
you know,
You've got inside it, underneath it. I've done a lot of work thinking about theatre with Ocean Vuong and what would it be to make a piece of theatre with his work? It would be impossible, and it would absolutely take away from the power of his language if you tried to stage this. It has its own place. But the structure, if you're looking at the form and the structure of the language, and then you look at the form and structure of a singular action, of gesture, or a movement towards, to reach for a book, to put on a jumper, to unlock a door, you can structure that action in the same way that you can structure a poem, with pauses, with hesitations, with
yeah,
twists and turns, and it becomes very physical. And when you break down his poetry, I get quite excited about the possibility of how that can be transposed physically,
yeah,
and the actor can reveal the structure and the form through the body. You mentioned earlier the physicalness of this language.
mm,
That absolutely right. It's so deeply physical. And as an actor, when you look at the language, you're looking for those words that ignite the spark of physical life. The hammering, the gathering fistfuls, the dipping my fingers back into the fire. These are all opportunities for the actor to go in somewhere. And then once you physicalize the language, what does that reveal to you
mm,
about your experience, and therefore reveal something about the poem?
yeah.
And that opportunity to live a poem through the body, to me, is quite thrilling.
I think you should drop him a line.
Yes, he's quite difficult. He's got a team of people around him who don't let you near him.
Yeah.
Uh, I've spoken to the literary agents, and I've spoken to a very nice man who I was in conversation with, and he ultimately, over 6 months, and then at the end of it, he said, "Look, I'm afraid it's not going to work." And then I was
Um,
advised to not push it any further, because if something went wrong, I'd be in the shit financially. So
it's terrible. Even poets get surrounded by these people who are inverted commas protecting them, but actually sucking the blood life out of them. You know?
yes, exactly. Well, interestingly,
You
I think it
know,
all went wrong because the Lincoln Center are doing, or the New York Philharmonic at the Lincoln Center are doing a musical response to his poetry. And from what I
ah,
understood, I don't quote me on this, but from what I understand, it hasn't gone very well. Of course, it hasn't.
yeah.
Um, the music's within the poetry, and he hasn't liked it.
Shame, 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 shame. Still,
Yeah.
this is a wonderful poem, and I would love it, Chris, if you could read it to us one more time for our readers so they can hear it again.
Ars Poetica as the maker. And God saw the light, and it was good. Genesis 1:4. Because the butterfly's yellow wing, flickering in black mud, was a word, stranded by its language. Because no one else was coming, and I ran out of reasons. So I gathered fistfuls of ash, dark as ink, hammered them into marrow, into a skull thick enough to keep the gentle curse of dreams. Yes, I aimed for mercy, but came only close as building a cage around the heart. Shutters over the eyes. Yes, I gave it hands, despite knowing that to stretch that clay slab into 5 blades of light, I would go too far. Because I, too, needed a place to hold me. So I dipped my fingers back into the fire, pried open the lower face until the wound widened into a throat. Until every leaf shook silver with that god awful scream. And I was done. And I was human.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for showing us this poem, Chris.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure, Helen.
For our listeners, I will put a list of Ocean Vuong's book, and particularly his biography, which is called On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, and also the text of the poem. Chris, thank you so much for coming on our podcast. It's been really, really interesting. And now we all want to apply to the Guildhall to be taught by you.
It's been a total delight, Helen. Real joy.
Thank you. If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.